All right, let's get into this. Back in 1991, out in the Arizona desert, one of the most audacious and frankly wild scientific experiments ever was literally sealed shut. It was called Biosphere 2, and it was this incredible attempt to build a perfect, self-sustaining replica of our own planet, all under a massive dome of glass.
But here's the hook. Imagine you're one of the 8 people sealed inside this little planet. You're supposed to be in there for 2 years, but then you start to realize that the very air you're breathing is just disappearing.
And this number, 14.5%, that's where things got really scary. That's the dangerously low oxygen level the atmosphere inside Biosphere 2 eventually hit. Now, to give you some perspective, that's like the air you'd find on a mountain over 13,000 feet high. So this really sets up the central mystery we're going to unpack. Where on earth did all the oxygen go? Yeah, so for the 8-person crew, what started out as this incredible mission of discovery, well, it pretty quickly turned into a struggle against an invisible enemy. Their brand new world was, quite literally, losing its breath.
But before we get to that crisis, you gotta understand the dream behind it. Biosphere 2 wasn't just some practice run for building a colony on Mars, though that was part of it. The bigger idea was to create a laboratory that could help us finally understand our own planet, what the scientists called Biosphere 1.
They were actually trying to kickstart a whole new field of science called comparative biospherics. The idea was pretty brilliant, right? If you can build a second, closed biosphere and watch it work, or not work, you might just learn the fundamental rules that keep our first and only home running.
And this quote from 20 years before the experiment even started, it just nails the motivation. The fact that we didn't know how to build a working planet was proof of how little we actually understood about our own. Biosphere 2 was a gutsy attempt to change all that.
And let me tell you, the attempt was nothing short of monumental. You have to see the sheer scale and the incredible complexity of what they actually built.
So this thing covered more than 3 acres, a massive, airtight structure of glass and steel that was engineered to be almost perfectly sealed off from the outside world. We're talking a leak rate of less than 10% a year, which was just unheard of. And inside, they didn't just build a place for people to live, they built a world.
They had a whole rainforest biome, for starters. It was packed with over 300 different species of tropical plants, and it was designed to evolve and mature just like a real one, complete with its own mountain and a running stream.
And then, right next door, a totally different world, a coastal fog desert modeled after the ones you'd find in Baja California, full of cacti and other plants built for a much, much drier climate.
And then there was the most ambitious part, a 1 million-gallon saltwater ocean. It had its own living coral reef, a lagoon, even a wave machine. It was just teeming with life. So you see, this wasn't just a fancy greenhouse. It was a network of living, breathing, interacting ecosystems.
But of course, the moment those giant doors were sealed shut, the carefully planned dream started to drift away from reality. And sometimes, it drifted pretty dramatically.
You can really see the gap right here. The dream was a perfect, balanced world. The reality, well, it was ecological chaos. They expected a stable atmosphere. Instead, oxygen plummeted and CO2 went on a roller coaster. They planned for diverse ecosystems, but they got widespread species die-offs. And that abundant food supply, it turned into a constant struggle on a calorie-restricted diet.
The problems really started with the air. See, here on Earth, our enormous oceans and atmospheres act like giant shock absorbers, keeping things stable. But inside Biosphere 2, with its tiny little atmosphere, the CO2 levels would swing wildly every single day, dropping way down as the plant sucked it up in the sunlight and then spiking like crazy at night.
But the much bigger problem, our central mystery, was the oxygen. As you can see, they started with normal air, 20.9% oxygen. But within 16 months, it hit that critical low of 14.5%, and they were forced to pump oxygen in from the outside. So what happened? The culprit, it turned out, was the concrete. The soil was super rich with microbes, and they were just feasting, consuming oxygen and pumping out CO2. But then, a second chemical reaction kicked in. The CO2 was reacting with the unsealed concrete, forming calcium carbonate. In other words, the oxygen was literally getting locked into the walls of the building.
But in the middle of this whole crisis, something amazing was happening to the crew. Because their farm wasn't producing as much food as planned, they were forced onto this super nutrient-dense but very low-calorie diet. And the results were just startling. Their cholesterol levels plummeted, their blood pressure dropped, they saw physiological changes that, up until then, had only really been seen in lab animals on these extreme, life-extending diets.
So, you could say that Biosphere 2 failed in its mission to be a self-sustaining world. But as an experiment, it succeeded brilliantly. The things it taught us about our own planet were just profound.
Probably the single biggest lesson was all about scale. We learned just how much we depend on the massive size of Earth's oceans and atmosphere to act as buffers to keep our world stable. These are these giant systems we totally take for granted, but Biosphere 2 proved they are absolutely essential. And the second big lesson? Ecosystems are not set-it-and-forget-it machines. To stop weeds from taking over or to keep pests in check, the crew had to constantly step in. They had to become what they called keystone predators, actively managing their tiny world to keep it from spinning into chaos.
And that really leaves us with one last big question to think about. This experiment proved beyond a doubt how unbelievably hard it is to manage a tiny 3-acre world. Which really makes you stop and wonder, how well are we doing managing our much, much larger and infinitely more complex Biosphere 1?